The earth shudders. A jagged clod of dry clay slams against the tanker's helmet. July 1944. 4 in the morning. The close-range blast of a 120mm mortar shell cuts the crew's heavy sleep short. Gromov opens his eyes. His mouth tastes of ash and machine oil. The air is thick with river dampness and the stench of last night's fires. The shell hit 30 meters from their cover. Dirt cascades down the trench walls. To the east, a gray dawn breaks, torn apart by yellow flashes. The low, guttural thrum of German engines is already weaving into the continuous roar of distant cannon fire. The enemy is probing the line. Behind them lies the hard-won pontoon crossing over the Dniester. The wooden decking groans under the weight of artillery tractors. Cold water slaps against the sides of the inflatable pontoons. A steady stream of battered infantry limps toward the eastern bank, while fresh reserves push west. This is the only artery, a thin thread through which the lifeblood of the offensive, the front's main forces, pulses. The Germans know it. The enemy vanguard is already tightening the pincers around the bridgehead. A kill box is forming. The fall of the crossing would mean catastrophe. Tens of thousands of men would be pinned against the river without ammunition. The army would be annihilated. The radio hisses inside the tank's metal womb. The battalion commander's dry voice tears through the static. Sokol, this is base. Hold the bridge. At all costs. Out. Gromov stares silently at the radio operator. The man's face is caked in deep-set soot. Copy, base. On it. The operator tosses into the mic. His tone is flat. No discussion. No fear. Fear burned out in the steppes a year ago. All that remains is thought as instruction. The muscle memory of professionals, honed to automation. Gromov rests his hand on the turret's cold armor. The metal is slick with morning condensation. The crew stirs. Their movements are sparse, economical. The driver climbs into his hatch.
A kick to the levers. Fuel injection. The heavy diesel engine coughs up black smoke. It stutters, roars, and settles into a steady, vibrating growl. 46 tons of Ural steel tremble with a fine shiver. The factory shift begins. Moving the machine into position isn't a feat of heroism. It's back-breaking physical labor. The transmission wails in low gear. The control levers are stiff, demanding raw strength from the driver. The heavy tank crawls out of cover. Wide tracks tear into the damp earth, churning grass into muck. The machine crushes young brush. The tank tilts over the edge of a fresh bomb crater, slides down, scooping thick clay with its glacis plate, and claws its way up the opposite slope with a straining diesel howl. Inside the turret, it is pitch black, sliced only by the dim glow of the instrument panels. The stench of diesel, sour sweat, and gun grease hits the lungs instantly. Gromov presses his face to the periscope. Ahead lies a pock-marked field, the mangled skeletons of trees, and a thick gray mist crawling through the lowlands. Gromov scans the terrain. Every hill, every dip is the geometry of survival. The defensive line demands perfect cover. To the left, the ruins of a shattered stone mill loom dark. To the right, an impassable swamp. The tank creeps toward the ruins. It's a smart position, but to reach it, they must cross open ground. German mortar crews are already bracketing the moving target. The whistle of falling shells cuts through the headsets and thick armor. The pressure mounts with every 100 meters gained.
Driver, short stop, hard left!
Gromov's voice is steady. The tank jerks. The left track locks. The right one grinds into the soil with a crunch. The 46-ton monolith pivots on the spot. A second later, a black pillar of earth and TNT erupts exactly where they had just been. Shrapnel hammers the frontal armor. A dry, sharp clang, like a handful of gravel thrown against iron. The machine keeps moving.
War is a workshop where failing to meet the quota is paid for in blood, and a defect costs you your life. The crossing disappears behind a hill. The crew is cut off now, one heavy tank facing an unfolding German strike group. Through the periscope, organized movement begins at the forest's edge. Grey silhouettes fan out across the scorched grass. Infantry. Behind them, the boxy shapes of armored personnel carriers. The enemy is methodical, unhurried, massing forces for the first push. They're just doing their jobs too. The diesel roars at max RPMs. The tank slams into the mill ruins. Brickwork crumbles under steel treads, collapsing onto the glacis in a cloud of red dust. The dust instantly chokes the vision slits. The driver yanks the levers. The engine drops its revs and settles into an idle. Silence falls abruptly. A heavy silence that makes the ears ring. All that can be heard is the steady breathing of the men and the distant rumble of German motors. Gromov stays glued to the optics. The smell of cordite seeps through the ventilation. Position secured. The mill's thick walls provide partial cover and mask the machine's silhouette. But a deadly threat lurks in this silence. The enemy already realizes the direct route to the river is blocked. The radio operator looks up at the commander. His eyes are bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Comms with the infantry are dead, Commander. The line's been cut. We're on our own." Gromov nods. Loneliness on the front line is a calculated variable. No time for regrets. "Gun to action! Load AP!" Gromov orders. The loader turns silently to the ammo rack. Calloused hands grip the heavy shell. 25 kilograms of dead weight. Every movement is refined by hours of drill. The clang of the breech block sounds like a hammer hitting an anvil in the cramped space. The breech is locked. Through the veil of morning mist, the first spark flashes. A short scream passes over the turret. An armor-piercing round passes high, shearing off the remains of the brick wall. Bricks crash down onto the engine compartment. The German vanguard has started ranging their shots. The clock is ticking. Every second is now measured by the thickness of the armor and the speed of reaction. Gromov presses against the sight. Cold glass bites into his brow. In the crosshairs, a gray landscape spitting fire. The steel monster sits motionless, awaiting the order to kill. The air trembles from methodical impacts. German 81mm mortars lay down a blind but dense barrage across the lowlands. Shrapnel bites into the dry soil with a foul hiss, shearing thin branches and drumming against the tank's armor in a dry, irritating hail. The defilade behind the ruins of the old stone mill isn't just natural cover. It is a strict engineering solution to an extremely complex problem. They must survive direct fire and land a crushing blow first. The heavy tank crawls into the stone trap in slow, heavy lurches. The driver yanks the stiff metal control levers. Every movement of the tracks requires colossal physical effort and surgical precision. The transmission wails at low frequencies, vibrating through the spine. Wide steel treads crush spent brick, grinding it into thick red dust. This dust settles in a heavy layer over the dark green paint of the massive frontal plates. The war machine's silhouette merges with the mangled landscape.
Camouflage is forged by the death of the old building itself. The twisted metal of the collapsed roof hangs overhead, creating a natural shield against the enemy's persistent aerial reconnaissance. The 122mm gun barrel settles perfectly into a narrow breach in the thick, load-bearing wall. The trap's geometry is flawless. The frontal armor, set at sloped angles, faces the expected exit corridor of the retreating German column. The flanks are securely covered by the impassable swamp to the left and the impenetrable mass of brickwork to the right.
The Predator is hunkered down in its den. The driver kills the diesel. A heavy, ringing silence falls instantly, broken only by the distant, muffled thuds of mortar rounds hitting the crossing. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the temperature spikes. The air grows thick and viscous with the smell of heated metal, acrid gun grease, and human sweat. The space is crushed tight by armor. The crew works in absolute silence. Any words now are redundant. They only waste precious oxygen and break concentration. Gromov leans into the cold optics of the panoramic sight. His eye instinctively catches the black hash marks of the scale. The left fire sector, the scorched skeleton of a wheeled tractor at the edge of the field. Range, exactly 800 meters. The right sector, the sharp bend of a dry creek bed. Range, 1,200 meters. The center, a gentle hill overgrown with tall, withered grass. This is the ideal kill zone, a deadly crossroads. The fire sectors are calculated with cold mathematical precision. The tank has finally transformed into a camouflaged, stationary sniper rifle, weighing a colossal 46 tons. The loader takes a short, deep breath. The routine of the destruction conveyor begins. This heavy tank's ammunition uses a separate loading system. This inevitably slows the overall rate of fire, but in exchange, it provides devastating destructive power upon impact. Hands in stiff, oil-stained canvas gloves grip the cold steel of the first armor-piercing shell. 25 kilograms of dead, lethal weight. One wrong move in the cramped fighting compartment, and the steady rhythm of work will break. A precious second of combat lost forever. Back muscles strain to the limit, fighting the weight. The shell slides smoothly but with maximum force deep into the bore. It is immediately followed by the massive casing packed with the propellant charge. The heavy steel wedge of the breech block slams shut with a deafening metallic clang. The breech is locked tight. In the enclosed volume of the turret, this sharp sound hits the crew's eardrums harder than an actual shot. Internal mechanisms have been meticulously checked. At the driver's station, oil pressure is monitored. His hand rests on the starter button, ensuring the diesel is ready to roar at a moment's notice. Tension twists nerves into a tight, pulsing knot. Every new second of agonizing waiting weighs on the tanker's psyches, heavier than any physical fatigue. The clock ticks. Time stretches subjectively. 1 minute of sitting motionless in an ambush feels longer than a multi-hour march. The enemy mortar fire suddenly shifts toward the river. The enemy is changing tactics and the vector of their pressure. Any mistake in camouflage now costs the lives of the entire battalion holding the crossing. Suddenly, through the distant roar of the cannonade, a completely new, alien sound breaks through. It's the high-pitched, unpleasantly strained crackle of a high-performance two-stroke engine. On the crest of the central hill, right in the focus of the calibrated fire sector, a grey silhouette appears. A heavy German reconnaissance motorcycle with a sidecar rolls into view. 3 men in grey field uniforms. The driver kills the engine abruptly. The machine stops at the very peak of the hill. The German officer sitting in the sidecar slowly brings field binoculars to his eyes. The enemy is methodically probing the defense's blind spot. A brutal survival paradox emerges instantly.
To fire the main gun now would be a fatal mistake, immediately giving away their hidden position before the enemy's main armored column arrives. To stay silent and do nothing means allowing an experienced scout to visually spot the breach in the mill wall and the fresh tracks of churned earth. If the Germans manage to transmit precise coordinates over a portable radio, a firestorm of heavy self-propelled artillery will rain down on these ruins within 2 minutes. The trap will be smashed to pieces, along with the hunter inside. "Leave the main gun alone," Gromov mutters through clenched teeth. His voice is bone dry, completely stripped of human inflection. "Coax. Short burst. Make it count." The gunner gently, without haste, squeezes the steel trigger. The Degtyaryov tank machine gun snaps to life instantly. A short, vicious burst of fire rips through the thickening morning air. The 7.62mm caliber hits the mark dead on, without a single miss. Tracers stretch like a bright, invisible thread toward the silhouette on the hill. Cause immediately transitions into irreversible effect. The motorcycle jerks violently from direct hits to the engine block, tips onto its right side, and pummels down the steep slope, kicking up a thick cloud of dry dust. The figures in gray uniforms drop like sacks into the scorched grass and remain absolutely still. The officers' binoculars glint dully in the sun, 10 meters from the mangled metal. The scouts are successfully neutralized. The trap has snapped shut again, remaining completely invisible to the main wave of retreating forces. Gromov doesn't pull his strained gaze from the optics. A short machine gun burst won't draw any extra attention against the backdrop of the general non-stop noise of the ongoing battle. But the scouts' failure to return will inevitably start an invisible stopwatch. The Germans will realize very soon that this corridor is far from safe, and they will come to test it with the strength of frontal armor. Inside the tank, a thick, ringing silence hangs once more, broken only by the heavy, raspy breathing of the loader. The first 122mm armor-piercing shell waits patiently for its target in the dark, oiled bore of the barrel. The death trap is set. The silence presses against the eardrums, the heavy, viscous silence of an ambush. Inside the tank, the air turns thick with the smell of scorched metal, spent machine oil, and stagnant sweat. On the horizon, where the morning mist slowly bleeds into the gray dust of the shattered road, a blurred movement appears. At first, they are just dark, formless blots. Then, the high-quality optics of the sight pick out the sharp, angular edges of enemy armor. A German column pulls out of a deep hollow. They are moving in a hurry, in a tight marching formation, maintaining their travel order. The enemy is methodically retreating toward the crossing. They have no idea that their route has already been cut off by Ural steel. Angular armored personnel carriers crawl in the lead. Wide tracks clank against the dry earth. Behind the armored sides sits infantry in gray uniforms. Behind them, the massive silhouettes of heavy tanks emerge. A Panther leads the way. The long barrel of its 75mm gun sways hungrily over the bumps. It is a dangerous, high-tech, and lethal beast. The quality of German optics is superb. The gun's ballistics are capable of punching through the frontal armor of Soviet machines at extreme ranges. But right now, this machine is stone blind. Guards Captain Gromov's crew has merged with the ruins of the old mill. The trap is wide open. The steel predator waits. The distance closes rapidly. 1,500 meters, 1,200, 1,000. Gromov says nothing. His face has turned into a frozen mask of soot and tension. His fingers are locked onto the edges of the commander's periscope, knuckles white. Inside the cramped turret, only the loader's heavy, ragged breathing can be heard. Nerves are stretched to the physical breaking point. It feels as though the dull thud of the crew's hearts echoes rhythmically within the armored box. The column confidently enters the guaranteed kill zone. A stray machine gun burst from the enemy's forward screen blindly rakes the bushes. A few rogue bullets strike the tank's sloped glacis plate with a ringing, sharp snap. Showers of bright sparks fly.
Fine stone grit from the shattered wall showers down onto the narrow vision slits. Gromov doesn't even blink. This isn't aimed fire. The enemy is just reflexively probing the brush along their path. Basic instinct demands an immediate response, to strike back, to protect oneself. Cold professionalism demands they wait. Another 100 meters. Every second of delay exponentially increases the chances of the target's absolute destruction. The Panther heavily exposes its vulnerable flank as it slowly rounds the scorched skeleton of the wheeled tractor. Metal treads churn the mud. This is the perfect profile, a flawless, lethal angle for the heavy caliber. "Put the crosshairs on it," Gromov's whisper, dry and utterly devoid of human emotion, cuts through the thick silence. "Lead tank, armor piercing. Target in sight," the gunner responds, just as mechanically dry. His right eye is pressed hard against the sight's rubber eyepiece. The hand wheels of the traversing mechanism grind softly. The heavy turret shifts smoothly by fractions of a millimeter. The black crosshairs settle exactly under the turret ring of the German cat. "Ready. Fire!" The strike. The tank's enclosed space instantly explodes in a blinding white flash and a deafening roar. The monstrous recoil of the 25-kilogram shell hurls the 46-ton war machine backward. The steel shock absorbers clang piteously. The 122mm gun barrel bellows out a long pillar of flame and acrid yellow smoke. The massive breech block recoils with a crash. The extractor spits out the smoking, red-hot brass casing. It clatters against the steel floor of the ribbed decking. The ringing is deafening. A piercing, continuous shriek of heavy shell shock instantly fills their ears. The armor-piercing shell covers the distance in a fraction of a second. The kinetic energy of the steel slug is monstrous. It doesn't just penetrate the hardened German armor, it crushes the very crystalline lattice of the metal with a sickening crunch. The hit lands exactly under the wide turret ring. The stowed ammunition detonates instantly. The Panther's multi-ton turret, long gun and all, is ripped from the hull like a lid blown off a boiling cauldron by colossal pressure. The metal structure flies several meters into the air, tumbling heavily through the blue-gray smoke. A blinding pillar of roaring flame geysers from the mangled hull. The shockwave levels the nearby infantry, tossing men to the roadsides. "Direct hit! Target destroyed!" the gunner states dispassionately. He doesn't look away from the sight. His hands are already confidently spinning the wheels, shifting fire to the next vehicle. The trap has snapped shut for good. The illusion of a safe retreat is torn to shreds. Primal chaos erupts on the dirt road. APC drivers slam on their brakes. Heavy vehicles lurch into one another with a metallic crash. Infantry spills over the steel sides like peas onto the dusty ground, desperately trying to find cover in the ditches. The burning Panther, belching thick black smoke, completely chokes the narrow road. It becomes an impassable wall of fire for the entire column. The enemy is disoriented, but this is a professional, battle-hardened army. Shock paralyzes them for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the brutal reaction begins. The surviving tanks jerk their boxy turrets toward the ruins of the stone mill. Firing points roar to life one after another.
The air is instantly filled with the dense howl of flying metal. Dozens of machine guns begin to fiercely, methodically shred the mill's brickwork. Bright tracers stitch a thick, deadly web through the thinning morning mist. Medium-caliber, armor-piercing shells begin to thud dully against the thick walls of the cover. The old stone facade of the mill collapses with a roar, exposing the dark green silhouette of the Soviet heavy tank to the enemy. The silence of the perfect ambush has been replaced by the deafening, continuous roar of a steel meat grinder. The enemy knows exactly where the death came from. Now, hundreds of kilograms of steel are flying their way every minute. Ricochets off the sloped frontal armor howl like wounded beasts. Inside the machine, the temperature jumps another few degrees. The ventilation fan is completely failing to clear the thick, choking powder smoke. Breathing becomes physically painful. Eyes water from the acrid, corrosive stench of burning. There is no room for error. Retreat is impossible. High explosive! On the infantry to the right, Gromov commands. His voice sounds like the sharp clatter of a bolt being racked. The loader is already heaving the next massive shell. His thick tunic is soaked through with sweat. His hands, covered in deep-set black grease and bleeding scrapes, work like the pistons of a reliable factory machine. The open, merciless battle has begun. There are no more tactical ruses. There is only thick frontal armor, the caliber of the gun, and the mechanical endurance of 4 men bolted inside a scorching steel box under a hurricane of fire. The enemy column is trying to deploy for a massed attack. They outnumber them 10 to 1, but they are trapped in a narrow corridor, and before them stands an insurmountable Ural barrier. The point of no return has been crossed. The battle shifts irreversibly into the stage of a non-stop mechanical conveyor. Emotions burn out completely, leaving behind nothing but drilled muscle reflexes. Inside the cramped armored box, the temperature climbs relentlessly toward 50 degrees Celsius. The metal, radiating heat from the shots and the heavy diesel, pours warmth into the enclosed space. The fan wails strainedly somewhere overhead, but is utterly useless against the thick blue powder haze hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Oxygen is catastrophically low. Every gasping breath sears the throat with acrid chemical smoke. The heavy tank carries out a methodical culling of enemy vehicles. The German column is stripped of even the slightest room to maneuver on the narrow dirt road. Enemy drivers panic as they try to turn around, inevitably exposing their vulnerable flanks to direct hits of enormous destructive power. Armor piercing, on the carrier, fire! Gromov's clipped order. The shot. The monstrous recoil shakes the 46 tons of Ural steel once again. The clang of the steel extractor. Another smoking brass casing rings against the ribbed floor, adding its searing heat to the turret's volume. Spent casings are already rolling underfoot, making it hard to move. The loader is working at the absolute limit of human physical capability. His sole task is to ensure the continuity of the lethal fire. Separate loading ammunition is both the curse and the primary weapon of this tank. First, the heavy armor-piercing shell goes into the breech. Then follows the massive casing with its powerful propellant charge. The weight of each shell is exactly 25 kilograms. It is dead, incredibly heavy weight, slick with factory cosmoline. The muscles of his back and shoulders seize in agonizing cramps from the constant, unnatural twisting in the extremely cramped fighting compartment. His thick, faded tunic is plastered to his body, drenched in sticky sweat. Brutal dehydration parches his throat. His lips are cracked from dryness and bleed slightly. The loader stopped feeling the pain in his raw, bloodied knuckles long ago. He has ceased to be a man. He is merely a mechanism, a reliable piston system in this massive machine of death. Grab the heavy metal from the tight rack. Pivot with the whole body. Ram it into the bore with force. Close the breach. The environment was a constant weight on the psyche. Outside, a steady hail of rifle rounds and shrapnel drummed against the sloped glacis plate. The German tankers had finally zeroed in on the concealed position in the mill ruins. Their return fire was growing denser, more precise. Ricochets howled around the turret in an irritating, never-ending shriek. "HE! Lead of the column!" The loader grabbed the heavy steel cylinder without looking. A short lunge toward the scorching breech. Metal ground against the breech block. The heavy casing followed. The sharp slam of the block. Then, the rhythm broke. A dry, discordant metallic crunch replaced the usual ringing clank. The mechanism failed. The semi-automatic action of the massive wedge breech seized tight. The heavy steel wedge jammed halfway. The gun was instantly paralyzed. "Jam!" the gunner rasped, his voice cracking from a sudden surge of primal tension. A second's delay under this much fire was a death sentence. The monstrous punching power of the 122mm gun was always offset by its agonizingly slow rate of fire. Every shell in this fight was worth its weight in gold. And right now, there was no shot. The massive tank had instantly turned into a blind, defenseless target, dumbly soaking up hits to its armor. There was no time to diagnose the failure. The cause was either a simple warp in the hot casing's flange or a buildup of hard carbon in the grooves. The result was a total halt of the artillery conveyor. The effect was the inevitable destruction of the crew. The loader didn't waste a second on words. He dropped heavily to his knees, skinning them raw on the ribbed iron floor plates. His right hand frantically fumbled for the short, heavy steel sledgehammer mounted near the ammo rack, the crudest tool of last resort. His forearm muscles bulged unnaturally from the sharp, desperate effort. There was barely any room to swing under the breech. A sharp blow. The heavy steel head slammed into the protruding lever of the breech wedge with a deafening, ear-splitting ring. Yellow sparks flew in the thick darkness of the turret. The metal didn't budge. "Do it!" Gromov snarled, his eye glued to the optic. The enemy armored vehicle in his crosshairs was already swinging its massive turret toward them. A second strike. Hard, precise, furious. With the sickening screech of mangled brass, the wedge finally dropped into place. The breech was locked. Mechanical contact was fully restored. "Ready!" the loader wheezed. He spat a thick, viscous glob of saliva, heavy with the taste of blood, onto the filthy floor littered with spent casings. "Fire!" The tank heaved violently again from the massive discharge of kinetic energy. Another shell whistled toward the target. Through the commander's periscope, the heavy German APC was clearly seen disintegrating into flaming shards of iron. The infantry, desperately huddling behind its thin armor, were instantly swept away by the overpressure of the blast wave. The dirt road quickly turned into a solid, impassable corridor of death. Enemy vehicles erupted one after another, turning into choking, blinding pyres. Thick, greasy black smoke blanketed the lowlands, mingling with the remnants of the gray morning mist. The German assault column couldn't withstand such colossal pressure. Having lost their lead vehicles, and with no real way to suppress the hidden strongpoint, they began a forced, panicked retreat. They backed away, ruthlessly abandoning groaning wounded and smoking wrecks. The surviving enemy tanks crawled back behind the safety of the ridgeline, snapping back with disorganized, unaimed cannon fire. The relentless, methodical shelling had finally broken their initial offensive momentum.
The physical, superhuman endurance of 4 exhausted men inside a scorching steel box had just decided the outcome of this brutal phase of the battle. The conveyor of death was back in business.
Ahead lay only a short, tense pause before a new, even more terrifying enemy strike. Smoke from burning vehicles crawled across the scorched grass. The brief lull was deceptive. Through the thick gray veil, massive silhouettes rolled onto the ridgeline. Infantry frantically deployed steel trails. Long, predatory barrels dropped to the horizontal. The enemy had rolled out heavy 88mm anti-aircraft guns for direct fire. They were the perfect armor killers. Their flat ballistics left no chance for survival. The barrels were pointed straight at the mill ruins. A flash. The air compressed into a tight knot. A blow of monstrous force slammed into the tank's glacis plate. 46 tons of Ural steel shuddered, shock absorbers screeching in protest. The armor-piercing slug ricocheted off the sloped armor with a wild shriek, soaring high into the gray sky. The factory welds held under the inhuman pressure. The armor wasn't breached, but the kinetic energy didn't just vanish. It burst into the confined space of the fighting compartment. Gromov's head snapped forward. His face smashed into the hard steel rim of the commander's hatch with a crunch. Blinding white light exploded in the darkness. Thick, hot blood from his split forehead flooded his left eye and the cold optics of the periscope. A piercing, unbearable high-frequency ringing instantly filled his ears. The world lost all sound of battle, turning into a silent, pulsing image of sharp pain. "Commander!" The gunner's voice came through the cotton wool haze, muffled as if from deep underground. Gromov shook his head hard. Thick drops of blood fell onto the filthy collar of his faded tunic. He fiercely wiped away the red veil with the back of a grimy hand. The physical pain sobered him, dragging him back to reality. "I'm up. Sight on the flash. HE. Fire!" His voice was dry, devoid of emotion. The loader silently shoved a heavy shell into the breech. 55 pounds of death settled onto the loading tray. The breech clanked. Shot. The recoil hammered his frayed nerves. The 122mm shell howled toward the hill. The earth erupted in a black geyser right in front of the German flak position. The enemy crew was swept away by the overpressure. The heavy trails were tossed into the air like toothpicks. A second flash erupted from the right. Another armor-piercing shell bit into the running gear. The tank jerked left in an unnatural, convulsive spasm. The deafening crunch of tearing metal easily drowned out the monotonous ringing in the crew's ears. The wide steel track slid off the drive sprocket with a sickening clatter. The heavy treads unspooled across the churned-up earth. The vehicle listed noticeably to the port side. All mobility was gone. The tank had finally become a stationary steel target for execution. "Left track's blown!" the driver yelled. His fingers gripped the now useless steering levers until his knuckles turned white. "Keep the engine running. We fight from here," Gromov said flatly. No panic. His dehydrated, heavily concussed body was functioning on pure combat muscle memory. The ambush had irrevocably turned into a direct artillery duel, the ruthless mathematics of a war of attrition. The Germans fired methodically, driving shells into the vehicle's silhouette. The third hit struck exactly at the turret ring. Sparks fountained in every direction. Inside the tank, red-hot spall cracked off the armor. Searing, razor-sharp metal shards bit into the crew's exposed skin. The loader groaned, reflexively clutching a bleeding shoulder. His hand immediately returned to the ammo rack. The rate of fire could not drop for a single second. The heavy tank's gun belched fire again.
The shell landed dead on target. Another German gun crew was instantly turned into a bloody mess of mangled iron and torn bodies. But new crewmen stepped into their places without hesitation. The enemy pushed blindly with sheer numbers and iron discipline.
The strikes of steel slugs against the armor merged into one continuous, maddening roar. Every new hit violently jarred the men's insides. The air inside reached a critical temperature. There was physically nothing to breathe. Thick propellant gases stung their inflamed eyes to tears. Gromov stared through the sight with his one good eye. The black crosshairs jumped constantly from the heavy tremors of the immobilized machine. "Right 005, AP," the commander rasped, spitting a glob of blood onto the floor. The loader breathed heavily in ragged gasps. His movements had slowed noticeably, but they retained a lethal mechanical precision. Shell, massive casing, breech wedge, hard slam. The turret turned slowly to the right with the strained whine of overheated electric motors. The gunner habitually caught a new enemy flash on the hill in his sights. Shot! A firestorm erupted from the barrel. Another German gun fell silent forever. A fourth, terrifying blow, right in the geometric center of the sloped glacis plate. The thick Ural steel withstood even this limit. Deep, jagged silver craters remained on the dark green armor. The metal melted from the colossal kinetic pressure, but it stubbornly refused to let death inside. Death paced helplessly on the outside of the armor, scratching at it with blunt steel claws. The crew had ceased to be ordinary men. They had become a direct extension of their machine, reliable mechanisms of flesh and blood fused into the scorching iron. The pain had dulled. Fear had vanished long ago. All that remained was a cold, calculating hatred, and a single order pulsing continuously in their concussed brains. Hold the line. HE, infantry on the flank. Fire! Gromov wiped a fresh smear of blood from his face with his sleeve. The battered turret moved again. The immobile, heavily wounded tank continued to snap back with lethal fire, methodically and brutally picking off the advancing enemy crews. The direct duel continued without pause. The steel rang constantly, buckling under the blows, but it did not give in. The structural integrity of armored machines and living men was being tested right now at the edge of all physical laws. The enemy frantically prepared a new wave. The attacks withered. The steel wave of the massive German offensive broke against the immobile Soviet line. The valley before the ruined stone mill had rapidly transformed into a giant open-air crematorium. Thick, oily black smoke blanketed the mangled earth. The commander's gaze through the cracked panoramic optic took in the true scale of the destruction. A dozen heavy enemy vehicles burned like bright, blinding pyres at distances from 300 to 1,000 meters. The frames of angular APCs were twisted by overpressure. The heavy turrets of medium tanks had been blown off their rings and tossed aside. Inside the flaming metal boxes, stowed ammunition cooked off continuously. Muffled, guttural thumps of detonation hurled fountains of white sparks and chunks of white-hot iron high into the sky. The ground in front of the position was completely riddled with deep craters. They overlapped tightly, forming a dead moonscape. Yellow clay was thick with soot, motor oil, and blood. The direct frontal assault had finally collapsed. The enemy was taking critical, irreplaceable losses, but the momentum of their orders still pushed them forward. The enemy changed tactics on the fly.
The German infantry decided to exploit the forced immobility of the damaged Soviet machine. Gray, hunched silhouettes began to converge quickly and stealthily along a dry creek bed. They were coming from the right flank. The distance was closing fast. 150 meters. 100 meters. They were carrying heavy magnetic mines and bundles of anti-tank grenades. Their main goal was to get close to the heavy tank's blind spot and blow the engine compartment.
Gromov roughly wiped sticky sweat and dried blood from his face. His good eye caught a short, unnatural movement in the withered grass through the side vision block. Infantry. Right. H.E. The commander's voice sounded dry, like the snap of tearing canvas. The loader reacted solely on hardwired reflexes. His body was working at the absolute limit of muscular exhaustion. Hands in tattered, oil-stained mitts grabbed the heavy steel cylinder. A sharp lunge. The shell went deep into the bore with a loud metallic scrape. The massive casing followed. The hard slam of the massive breech wedge hit their eardrums. "Lay it on the creek bed. Bottom edge," Gromov commanded. The turret crawled slowly to the right with the strained howl of the overheated electric motor. The traverse mechanisms were choked with brick dust and fine metal spall, but they continued to function reliably. The gunner mashed his face into the rubber eye guard of the sight. The black crosshairs settled exactly on the edge of the dry creek, where helmets were flickering. "Shot!" The deafening roar violently jarred the armored box again. The 122mm high-explosive shell plowed into the dry earth right in front of the advancing line. A colossal shockwave instantly mashed gray uniforms into the yellow clay. Massive clods of earth and shrapnel-torn bodies were hurled in every direction. But the German infantry was disciplined. The survivors pressed themselves tight into fresh craters and stubbornly continued to crawl forward. The distance became critical. 80 meters. Gromov could clearly see the glint of blued steel in the enemy's hands. Grenades were ready for the toss. "Coax! Long bursts! Cut them off!" The commander threw the words into the clouds of propellant smoke. The gunner mashed the steel trigger. The tank's machine gun began to methodically, monotonously stitch the air with lead. Bright tracers bit into the creek's embankment in tight groups. The 7.62mm rounds left no chance for soft human flesh. The gray figures jerked reflexively from the hard, direct hits and went still forever in the road dust.
The flank attack choked on blood in a matter of seconds. No one else rose from the craters. The right flank was secured, drenched in lead. Gromov slowly traversed the periscope back to the frontal sector. The machine sat absolutely still, its left track blown. It had withstood a concentrated, monstrous hammering from enemy artillery. The Ural steel was covered in deep, jagged scars. Huge, gleaming silver craters from dozens of direct hits by 88mm armor-piercing slugs yawned on the dark green paint. The metal in these spots was hideously deformed by the colossal kinetic pressure. It had melted and flowed, forming ugly folds. The armor was thick with black soot, dents and deep gouges from thousands of fragments. The brickwork revetment had been completely leveled by explosions. The tank stood completely exposed. But the massive glacis plate was unbreached. The integrity of the armored capsule was fully intact. The crew was wounded and dazed, but alive and continuing to kill methodically. This became the turning point of the entire battle. A heavy, tense silence suddenly hung over the hill.
German commanders looked through Zeiss binoculars at the mangled, immobile, yet deadly Soviet tank. For them, it had turned into an insurmountable physical and psychological barrier. They saw how their best anti-aircraft guns had emptied their entire magazines into the glacis of this lone machine without the slightest result. They clearly saw the burning wrecks of their newest tanks and the infantry torn to shreds on the flank. The enemy finally realized the fatal mathematical impossibility of penetrating this armor from the front. The rational, cold calculation of German military doctrine suffered a critical failure in the face of raw, indestructible Ural power. The psychological collapse was swift and absolute.
The airwaves were instantly filled with sharp, panicked orders to withdraw. The engines of the surviving enemy vehicles roared at maximum RPMs. The columns began to frantically turn around right on the narrow road. APCs backed up, ruthlessly crushing their own dead and wounded. The enemy completely abandoned the direct assault on the crossing. They feverishly searched for bypasses. They retreated into deep lowlands, desperately trying to avoid the lethal crossroads at any cost. The firing gradually died down. First, the heavy calibers went silent. Then the shrill chatter of machine guns cut off. A heavy silence hung over the mangled battlefield, broken only by the crackle of burning metal. The iron debt had been paid in full with the enemy's blood. The battle rolled heavily, reluctantly back behind the ridgeline. The deafening roar of the hours-long artillery duel was replaced by a crushing, unnatural silence. This silence brought no long-awaited relief. It dropped onto the shoulders of the exhausted men like a multi-ton concrete block. Inside the mangled armored capsule, there was no room for the joy of survival. The air was thick, sticky, saturated through with toxic soot and fumes. It was physically impossible to breathe. Every ragged gasp seared the parched throat with thousands of tiny red-hot needles. The electric vent hummed, strained, and pitifully somewhere overhead, but it only circulated blue, choking smoke and biting brick dust in a closed loop. The loader sank heavily onto a massive pile of spent brass casings. His broad shoulders slumped. His arm muscles twitched in tiny, uncontrollable tremors from the monstrous physical overexertion. He coughed hoarsely, hacking up globs of black soot onto the ribbed iron floor. His faded tunic was stuck fast to his wet back, scorched by hot metal. The driver leaned back against his hard seat. His grimy fingers were curled around the locked steering levers. Gromov slowly, overcoming a savage weakness in his entire body, pulled his face away from the rubber eye guard of the periscope. The left side of his face was a solid mask of crimson and black. Thick blood from his deeply split forehead had flooded his eye, mixed with gun grease, and baked into a hard crust. His head split from the heavy effects of the concussion. The world had shrunk to the size of this scorching box. The temperature inside stubbornly held at around 120 degrees. The heated Ural steel generously radiated its stored heat into their inflamed bodies. There was no euphoria of survival. It was only a dull, heavy, leaden exhaustion. They survived, but the tank was paralyzed. The left track, blown by a direct hit, had turned the formidable war machine into a dead, immobile target. If the enemy infantry regrouped and struck from a new flank, the tankers would be nothing more than a piece of charred iron with corpses inside. Immobility was death. The situation dictated one hard solution. "Driver, loader!" Gromov's voice sounded like the dry scrape of rusted metal on glass. "The track! Fast!" No useless discussion.
The order dropped into the scorching air and immediately turned into action. With a muffled groan, the loader forced his utterly exhausted body to stand. He fumbled in the darkness for the heavy steel pry bars. The driver slammed his fist against the latches of the forward boarding hatch. The thick, armored lids swung open with a creak. A rush of cool morning air, heavily laced with the smell of scorched rubber and burnt flesh, burst inside. This gulp of fresh oxygen hit their lungs with the force of a gut punch. Two men slowly, heavily tumbled out of the machine onto the explosion-mangled, churned-up earth. Their legs buckled from weakness. The ground around them was thick with shrapnel and hot iron fragments. At that very moment, the heavy silence over the mill ruins was ripped apart by a sharp, whip-like crack.
A 7.92 millimeter bullet shrieks viciously, kicking up bright sparks from the glacis armor just 4 inches from the driver's head. An enemy sniper observer had dug in on the distant height. He had been waiting patiently, methodically, for this moment. The enemy left a lethal screen behind. "Get down!" the loader rasps. They instantly dropped prone into a filthy puddle mixed with broken brick and motor oil. The sniper took the immobilized tank under constant aim. Bullets began to snap against the turret and the open hatch rhythmically at 10-second intervals. The psychological pressure resumed with new force. Every movement outside now meant 100% risk of a bullet to the temple. But they couldn't lie in the mud. Time was working against them. The loader, clawing at sharp stones with raw elbows, crawled toward the ruptured track. The multi-hundred-pound steel ribbon had slid uselessly off the drive sprocket. The heavy treads were twisted. The driver crawled after him, dragging 2 massive iron pry bars. They shared a brief look. Their eyes were red, inflamed, completely devoid of any light. They lay in the mud, cheeks pressed against the cold steel of the road wheels. Another bullet rang against the metal above their heads. Lead fragments sprayed in every direction, biting into the thick fabric of their tunics. "Get the bar under the tread," the loader whispered through clenched teeth. His voice cracked from the strain. "Come on 3. 1, 2, 3!" Spent muscles bulged into hard knots. 2 men dig their heavy boots into the slick yellow clay, throwing their entire weight against iron pry bars. With a sickening metallic screech, the heavy track shifts 2 inches. Another sniper round slams into a link right next to the mechanic's trembling hands. He doesn't even flinch. Fear has atrophied entirely. All that remains is a dull, cold rage directed at this stubborn, dead metal. "Heavy piece of shit," the mechanic snarls, the words forced through a clenched jaw. "Again! Pull!" They strain until their tendons nearly snap. The skin on their palms splits, fresh blood mixing freely with the black grease on the pry bars. Millimeter by agonizing millimeter, the track crawls onto the steel teeth of the drive sprocket. A sharp pain stabs through their backs from neck to waist, the raw physiology of survival. Click. Another sniper shot. They ignore it. The loader drives the connecting pin home into the track lugs. A heavy blow from the sledgehammer follows. The lock snaps shut. The track is tensioned. Repairs under fire are complete. They collapse onto their backs directly into the churned earth, their strength spent. Their chests heave as air rasps in their lungs. The realization that they have miraculously survived brings no joy or relief. It comes only through the pulsing, unbearable agony in every torn muscle. They have simply survived to keep fighting.
The loader struggles onto his stomach and, squirming across the ground, reaches the belly escape hatch. The mechanic follows. They haul their broken bodies back into the sweltering womb of the machine. The hatch slams shut with a heavy clang, cutting them off from the world. Inside, the same impenetrable, suffocating darkness awaits. The loader slumps powerlessly against the cold ammunition rack, his arms hanging like dead weights. From the turret above, Gromov's hand slowly descends. The commander's fingers are shaking as he holds out a dented, scratched aluminum canteen. Inside, warm water with a metallic tang sloshes around. Without a word, Gromov passes it down. The loader takes it with stiff, blood-stained fingers and takes one long, desperate gulp. The water burns his cracked lips and runs down his chin, washing away the thick soot. He passes the canteen to the mechanic in silence. No one smiles. A vast, scorched void has opened up inside them, a void with no room for human emotion.
Only reflex lives there now. The tank is ready. The sky over the river suddenly splits with a low, vibrating roar. The sound hammers down, like a heavy press against their eardrums. A squadron of Soviet ground attack planes streaks directly over the tops of the mangled, scorched trees. For a fraction of a second, their broad, armored wings blot out the pale morning sun. Their arrival places a final, heavy period on this stage of the battle. The main frontline forces have broken through. The pontoon crossing over the Dniester held under the colossal pressure. Salvation is rolling in inevitably from the east. Lines of infantry emerge slowly from the morning mist. Hundreds of men in dusty, faded tunics crest the gentle slope. They advance with confidence, gripping their rifles and submachine guns, internally braced for a bloody breakthrough. They expected to meet dense, suppressive fire, a torrential rain of machine gun bullets, and the clatter of enemy tracks. But no breakthrough is required. Weapons are slowly lowered. Their pace instinctively slows. The eyes of the approaching soldiers fall upon a scene of absolute destruction. The wide valley before the ruined stone mill has ceased to exist as a natural landscape. It is now a gargantuan, smoldering graveyard. Dozens of burnt-out German tanks are scattered across the field, their hulls twisted by monstrous explosions. A thick layer of greasy black soot covers every square meter of the mutilated earth. The air is thick and dead, saturated with the nauseatingly sweet stench of burnt flesh, melted rubber, and acrid cordite smoke. The silence feels physically heavy, unnatural after hours of hellish thunder. At the dead center of this lunar landscape stands the Titan, a heavy Soviet tank. 46 tons of mangled, scarred, but unbroken Ural steel. The war machine looks terrifying. Its sloped frontal armor is pitted with deep, jagged, silvery craters from dozens of direct hits by German 88mm armor-piercing shells. In many places, the metal is scorched white, covered in ugly gray scars of melted steel and thick soot. The long barrel of the 122mm gun hangs low, heavy with fatigue. The shattered left track is tensioned haphazardly, glinting with fresh steel pins crudely hammered home. The tank resembles an ancient, wounded predator that has torn apart an entire pack of enemies and now breathes fitfully over the bones of the slain. The white-hot metal clicks and pops ominously as it cools in the morning air. The infantrymen draw closer, stopping 10 yards from the smoking behemoth. Not a word is spoken. Silently, in unison, the soldiers pull the dirty, sweat-soaked side caps from their heads. The officers of the rescued units slowly, as if in a dream, bring their hands to their caps in salute. They aren't just saluting a piece of iron. They are saluting the absolute limit of human endurance that stopped the steel avalanche. The heavy top hatch of the massive turret creaks open. From the dark interior, reeking of burnt oil, cordite, and blood, a man slowly rises, fighting the savage pain in his muscles. It is the tank commander, Guards Captain Gromov. His face is a frozen mask of black soot and grime ground into his pores. The left side of his forehead is a solid purple and blue hematoma from a violent impact against the gun sight. His thick tunic is soaked through with sweat and stiff with dried salt. In his inflamed, bloodshot eyes, there is no joy, no relief. Only a black, bottomless void, scorched clean by hours of witnessing death. An open-topped staff car speeds toward the tank's position, its bumper brushing through the brush. The brakes screech to a halt. A general, the commander of the tank corps, hurries out of the vehicle. His service uniform is pristine, fresh medals glinting dully on his chest. The general's face betrays extreme emotional shock. He walks toward the tank with quick strides, his stunned gaze sweeping across the smoking valley. He sees the true scale of the slaughter unleashed here. His staff officer mind understands clearly that a single immobilized crew stopped the guaranteed breakthrough of an entire enemy armored strike group. Emotion overwhelms him. He is ready to throw his arms around the exhausted tankers, ready to speak righteous words about a great military feat and the salvation of an entire army. Gromov jumps heavily, awkwardly, down onto the mutilated earth. His legs buckle for a moment from the savage exhaustion, his boots slipping in the bloody mud, but he instantly straightens into a rigid stance. No emotion, no pride. Only the cold, hard-wired mechanical reflex of a soldier before a superior officer. The captain brings an incredibly filthy, trembling hand to his tanker's helmet. The movement is minimalist, precise, and weary. "Comrade General." Gromov's voice is bone-dry, cracking like dead wood. There isn't a single drop of pathos or triumph in it. The designated line has been held. The vehicle is fully combat-ready, awaiting further instructions. The general freezes mid-step. The solemn words stick in his parched throat. The contrast is too sharp, too unbearable. Standing before him is practically a dead man walking. A man who has just passed through a mechanical meat grinder is matter-of-factly reporting his readiness to continue his grueling work. This icy, inhuman composure douses any emotional outburst from the general. He nods silently, his head heavy. He suddenly realizes that any words right now would sound like a pathetic, insulting sham in the face of such leaden, trench-borne exhaustion. Suddenly, the air above the scorched position stirs again. The dead silence is torn to shreds. From somewhere beyond the distant forest, strictly from the west, a new, alien sound carries. Low, vibrating, and guttural. The roar grows louder by the second, becoming denser. It is the steady, powerful thrum of heavy, high-performance diesels. German engines. The enemy has not surrendered. They are bringing up a fresh echelon for a new breakthrough attempt. The tank crew's reaction is instantaneous. The paralysis of the paper front vanishes. Leaden exhaustion is wiped from their muscle memory by a surge of adrenaline. The world of dry staff reports and unspoken emotions is closed forever. The endless war returns to its cycle. Gromov spins around, turning his back on the polished general. "To your stations! Battle stations!"
The commander's hoarse, animal roar tears through the air. The loader and driver, who just moments ago lay spent on the engine deck, bolt into action. Their bodies become reliable machines once more. They dive like fish into the cramped, sweltering hatches. Metal clangs viciously as the heavy armored lids slam shut, sealing the crew away from the outside world and the staff room bustle. The factory shift of death continues without a lunch break. The roar intensifies, hammering like a heavy press against inflamed eardrums. Inside the cramped armored capsule, the crew freezes. The driver's fingers lock onto the stiff control levers. The loader reflexively reaches for the hot breech of the 122mm gun, even though the ammo racks are nearly empty. The seconds of waiting stretch out like thick, sticky resin. But suddenly, the sound changes pitch. The low, steady roar of heavy diesels shifts into a rhythmic, straining chug. This is not a German marching formation. From behind the jagged edge of the forest, massive Soviet artillery tractors lumber into view, leaving deep ruts in the clay. The wind had simply shifted, carrying the echo of engines from the neighboring flank. Death takes a short reprieve. The alarm is false. "Stand down. It's our boys," Gromov mutters hoarsely, without the slightest hint of joy. No one exhales with relief. No one smiles. The leaden tension simply flows into a stage of monotonous waiting.
The captain, gripping the iron rungs with unresponsive hands, hauls himself out of the turret onto the fender. His boots slip on the metal, which is slick with a mixture of rainwater, blood, and motor oil. Gromov walks slowly, with a heavy limp, around the massive turret. His inflamed gaze fixes on the horrific gouges in the dark green paint. Here, an 88mm armor-piercing slug chewed out a massive, hideous crater. The metal had melted and run, forming jagged edges. The factory welds had groaned, but held under the colossal kinetic pressure, sealing death outside. Gromov runs a dirty, scraped palm over the wound. At that moment, an icy realization hits him. All their combat experience, all their sniper-like precision and inhuman endurance would have been worth nothing without this thick Ural armor. The true, fundamental line of defense had not been held here, in the mud of the Dniester. It had been held thousands of miles away, in the deep, frozen rear. The genuine victory in this brutal fight had been won by grim, nameless engineers. It had been clawed out by exhausted female lathe operators who stood for days at freezing machines in unheated workshops. Their frostbitten hands and hunger-induced feints had forged this indestructible shield. Steel had saved flesh. The factory assembly line flowed inextricably into the assembly line of death at the front. Every shell casing ejected here was a direct continuation of the labor there. A short distance away, on a charred tree trunk, the paper front unfolds. The arriving tank regiment commander sits hunched over a worn map case, methodically filling out award citations with a grease pencil. Dry, bureaucratic lines record the destroyed vehicles, the expended ammunition, and the tactical perimeter held. The tally of dead enemies settles neatly onto cheap gray paper. The routine of war turns blood into statistics. But the regiment commander suddenly halts his pencil. He raises his eyes to the mangled frontal plate of the IS-2, staring for a long time at the dents from the German shells. Then, with a heavy pressure that tears the paper, he writes a stark demand at the bottom of the form. Decorate the collective of the unnamed manufacturing plant with state orders. Without their engineering genius, this strategic bridgehead would have been ground to dust within the first 15 minutes of contact.
For the tank crew, this bureaucracy means nothing. A 3-axle supply truck rumbles toward the paralyzed machine, its wooden sideboards dropping with a crash. A new, grueling stage begins, loading the combat load. "Ready for stowage," the driver commands curtly from the bed of the truck. Gromov and the loader take their positions on the slick armor. The grueling physical labor begins. The separate loading process for the heavy gun requires colossal effort. The first armor-piercing shell, 25 kilograms of cold, dead metal, is slippery with cosmoline. The loader takes the heavy load, his back muscles tightening painfully. He carefully lowers Death into the dark, sweltering gut of the turret. There, in the pitch darkness of the fighting compartment, the radio operator stows the shells into the iron racks with economical movements. The clang of iron on iron rings out rhythmically, like the beats of a steel metronome. 1 shell, 2, 3. Their movements are precise, devoid of haste. Hands slip. Grease works its way into fresh abrasions, causing a dull ache. The smell of diesel fuel mixes permanently with the scent of fresh gunpowder. The massive brass casings with the propellant charges follow. Every casing passed is one guaranteed shot, one steady step toward the next battle. War never ends in victory. It simply takes a technical break so that men can replenish their supplies of TNT. The loading lasts an agonizing 40 minutes. This back-breaking labor, following absolute nervous exhaustion, finally burns away the last remnants of their strength. The loader leans against the gun barrel, wiping his filthy forehead with his sleeve. "Combat load full. Stowage closed," the radio operator's muffled voice carries from the turret. The top hatch closes with a heavy clang. The death machine is once again packed with explosives to the brim. The crew is loaded into the steel capsule. The mechanism is prepared for the next cycle. No thoughts of the future. No plans. There is only the present. The weight of metal in calloused hands. The smell of gunpowder. And the grim order to move. The routine of the slaughter continues. The airwaves crackle with panicked radio messages. In the concrete bunkers of the German Army Group headquarters, a paralyzing silence descends. Signal officers place stacks of dry, merciless reports on the general's tables. The offensive has foundered. The strike battalions were destroyed on the march, burned to the ground. The technological dictates of German engineering have collapsed into the muddy craters of an unnamed crossing. The vaunted 88mm guns expended their entire combat loads at point-blank range and could not penetrate the frontal armor of the new Soviet heavy tank. The shells simply ricocheted, leaving silvery craters. This is not a tactical failure. It is the mathematical collapse of an entire military doctrine. The enemy realizes the horror. In the East, a weapon has been created against which their machines are powerless. Cold panic creeps across the staff maps alongside the red arrows of Soviet counterattacks. Thousands of miles to the east, in the rugged Ural Mountains, a blue mist hangs from the breath of hundreds of people in a gargantuan frozen factory workshop. The temperature has dropped to 30 below. The iron gates are encrusted with frost, and the concrete floors are slick with ice. There is no frontline adrenaline here, only a brutal, monotonous battle for survival. The old shift foreman, using fingers frostbitten to the point of blackness, unfolds a crumpled, triangular field post letter. Around him, female lathe operators and haggard teenagers in tattered quilted jackets huddled together, their faces gray from sleep deprivation and metal dust.
The machine withstood 15 direct hits of heavy caliber. Not a single penetration of the frontal plate. We held the line. The enemy has been repelled. Thank you for the strong steel, the foreman reads hoarsely. Short, clipped phrases. No flowery gratitude. Only a military confirmation of the product's acceptance. Sparse tears roll down the hollowed cheeks of the factory workers, leaving pale tracks through the soot. But no one stops working for even a second. The heavy lathes continue to howl, and sharp cutting tools shriek as they peel shavings from white-hot billets. The production line does not falter. The plan demands more tanks. In the shadow of a massive bridge crane, the chief designer listens in silence. The crushing weight of months of doubt falls from his shoulders. The Soviet School of Tank Design has accomplished its mission, launching an indestructible monster into mass production. The calculations for armor thickness and slope angles proved flawless. The blueprints came to life, turning into an impenetrable wall of metal in the enemy's path. At the front, a thick night descends rapidly upon the mangled earth, hiding the smoldering hulks of German armor. Gromov's crew has finished loading. The heavy shells are locked in their racks. The 4 men are exhausted to the limit, holding on solely by reflex. But a new order has been received. There is no time for sleep. The commander lowers himself into his seat. The massive top hatch slams shut with a dull clanking sound. The trap is closed once more. Driver, start it up.
We're moving out. Gromov's voice sounds through the headsets, bone dry and steady. The driver presses the stiff starter button. The massive diesel engine coughs, spits a cloud of black smoke, and roars to life with deafening power. 46 tons of Ural armor shudder. The transmission howls as the driver yanks the control levers. Wide steel tracks grind spent shell casings and shattered brick with a sickening screech. The heavy tank crushes the remains of the brush and lumbers down from the pockmarked hill. Mutilated by shell scars, but unbroken, the machine vanishes into the pitch darkness, heading toward a new defensive line. And far to the east, piercing the icy air of the Urals, a factory whistle screams. It calls the hungry people to yet another shift at the frozen machines. The heavy, endless work continues.